Hey there. Hi,
Hi.
everyone.
Hey, everybody.
Well, we are switching gears today, my friend. Coming off of a couple episodes on defining success and moving now into the conversations we avoid.
Yeah.
Mindy, you want to kick us off?
Yeah. Well, thanks for joining us. Excited to have you at our podcast, Take the Lead, Change the Game. And like Lindsay said, we're going to pivot away from goals and success and really start talking about hard conversations and why they matter, and talking through the importance of these in our work relationships, in our personal relationships, and really to advance in your career as a leader. One of the most important skills I think a leader can have is being able to have these kinds of conversations with confidence, with compassion, and courage, and not being scared of entering into sometimes some tricky or complicated topics. Before we kind of get started with our topic, I do want to remind everyone that we just announced our SAFRA virtual leadership cohort. So if you want to apply, we're taking applications now. This will be our virtual cohort, so you can live anywhere in the country, for women lawyers looking to advance in their careers as leaders. Check out all of our information, and we're excited to have you apply and send it to people who you think might benefit from it. But let's kind of go back. Let's go into our topic. I teach, and I know Lindsay, you do too. We teach, and we have lots of conversations around how to have difficult conversations. And today we're not going to go into the mechanics of those, but we're going to talk about the why, because actually the why is the most important from my perspective. And conflict and hard conversations and complex conversations are so beneficial in so many ways. But what I have seen personally, professionally with my clients is when we have hard conversations, it's really where innovation comes from. It's where growth comes from. And it's where we deepen a lot of our relationships. And so I want to encourage people, when you think about hard conversations, and as Lindsay and I talk about this, is try to move that assumption that, like, oh, this is going to be tough, or oh, this conversation is going to be hard, to this conversation is important. This conversation is beneficial. So a lot of times I say, if it's hard or difficult, move it into it's important. And then if you think it's important, move it into this is a really good thing that's happening. And that mindset shift can help you. What do you think, Lindsay?
Absolutely. I think that viewing these hard conversations as an opportunity, either to find a solution, to become closer to the other person, to share their perspective, and to understand their perspective, are all really beneficial things. And actually, it's a way to, deeper, more meaningful relationships, both at work and outside of work. And so I'd like to take a minute and share just like a few sort of stats about conflict, so that we sort of ground ourselves in that. According to a 2024 study published by the Health Affairs Scholar, difficult conversations, or the environments that enable them, are tied to lower burnout and better mental health outcomes. And to me, that just goes to the fact that we're all really just craving human connection. And I think, similar to what you just said, Mindy, about, just reframing and changing perspective, like, conflict is a way, difficult conversations are a way for us to connect as human beings. Task conflict, i.e. disagreements about how to do work, combined with psychological safety. So you have to have that safety. And that tends to drive better performance because it forces critical discussion, as you mentioned, helps creativity, surfaces great ideas. I think that sometimes folks think that conflict avoidance creates psychological safety, right? We're all just safe if we don't talk about it. But in fact, it oftentimes tends to do the opposite, because like nobody knows how anybody really feels, right? If we're all just in conflict, or we have sort of false consensus about things, or we're just deferring to one, leadership voice or things like that. And so that stuff can be really harmful. According to a 2024 survey by Achievers, 2/3 of employees want to have tough conversations at work, but around 70% of employees avoid difficult conversations with bosses, peers, or direct reports. And of course, then tension can build, issues don't get resolved, and things can escalate. And then the last thing I'll say in terms of data is that hard workplace disputes and personality clashes cost about 2.8 hours per employee per week, which results in millions of dollars lost in productivity. And so there really is a cost at avoiding conflict and not diving into difficult conversations.
Yeah, and let me, give you a couple of reactions to some of this data. So this data, I would say, plays out in all the work that I do. I see all of these things being true. I know that people want to know where they stand in an organization. They want to know what's going on. So when we avoid conflict, we avoid hard conversations, people then don't know where they stand. They don't know what's going on. And then also this concept of burnout is real. And part of the reason that avoidance causes, burnout is because when you avoid something, you don't resolve it. So it's lurking in your brain. Sometimes it's really like at the forefront and you're actually anxiously thinking about it. But a lot of times it's lurking in the background, like this unresolved thing that you just are uncomfortable about. And, if you go into a meeting and you have this unresolved conversation, or there's something lingering, you're going to maybe ignore it and try to have the meeting, but it's always there. And we've all had that feeling where it's like, oh, I really need to say something to this person, but I don't want to, so I'm going to avoid it. It doesn't go away. And that's the thing I will say is the stat particularly about 70% of employees avoid these conversations, yet 2/3 want to have them.
Yeah.
When I teach like effective communication, or I teach how to have healthy conflict in a workplace, the resounding comment is, I want to have more of these conversations because people really crave that. And I also think that it creates this sense of trust. There's nothing like a conflict to build trust if it's handled effectively. And and just take a second to think about your personal life. Like, forget work for a second. Like, think of the people you love and care for the most and trust the most. You've probably had so many conflicts with them, so many hard conversations. Your spouse, your sisters, your mom, your dad, you've probably battled it out. You've probably had really hard conversations about very sensitive topics, but it strengthens the relationship because you know what each other are thinking. You understand sort of the root cause of maybe some conflict. And so I really hope that, you can rephrase some of this to think, wow, this is important, or this is going to be a great opportunity to advance our relationship and to really move into a different perspective.
100%. A couple sort of takeaways there. One is something you and I were talking about earlier, Mindy, which is, when we have conflicts that are sort of bubbling in the background, we tend to fill in the gaps. So the conversation is happening. It just might not be happening between two people, right? Like, yes. I will, if you and I are in a conflict and I'm worried about something, like maybe Mindy feels this way. And then I like perpetuate that narrative in my head. Whereas in fact, if we just talked about it, one, it may be totally different. And two, like it can smooth that over and confirm and say, how do we move forward? Yeah. Another thing that came to mind as you're talking about like people in our personal lives, one of my favorite things to do in my very strong personal relationship is say, we need to be able to talk about this when it comes up. This is a, continued, just a thing that we're working through. Tell me how to do this well, right? Because the way that we communicate, the meta communication, the communication about communication is also so critical and really varies from person to person and even relationship to relationship, depending on the history and the baggage that we carry.
Yeah. And, we're going to next time give you some tips. But one thing I would say that I think is important as like a precursor to that is it is okay to communicate about how you're going to communicate about the conflict. And it's okay to say, this is hard for me. Or like, I don't really know how to talk about this, but we got to talk about it. Yeah. And honestly, like that vulnerability is a key to this. And I don't think anybody is like always comfortable in these conversations. I would say, I am an expert in having hard conversations. It's what I get hired to do. Lindsay, same way. We do some crisis management work that is filled with hard conversations. There are times when I have a hard time still, and I do the like, what are they going to say? What are they thinking? And sometimes it's okay to say, hey, this is going to be tough, and I feel this way about this conversation. Or sometimes you can say, we need to have this conversation. I'm not really ready to have it yet, but I just want to let you know it's coming. I need to think about it. Can you think about it? Where should we have this conversation? And so part of it is it's okay to just be honest about how you're feeling. You don't have to go in like this is, everything. This is so easy for you.
No, and in fact, again, like vulnerability breeds trust and connection. And so, it may not be beneficial for us to share all of the things, right? Especially up front before we've had an opportunity to really process through how we want to approach it. But saying like, this is hard and I feel nervous, like, cause I really value our working relationship, or I really value, you as a person, or whatever it might be that you want to say. I think it's critical. Mindy, can you think of a time, and it's okay to be vague or general, but think of an example of when you had a difficult conversation and it really did sort of pave the way to a better working relationship?
Yeah. And I'll tell you sort of like a recent conversation, but what I will say overarching is I will tell you 99% of the time, maybe 99 point something percent of the time, these hard conversations end up resulting in something positive. So like truly, even the ones that you're sweating through, they truly end up be getting you to a different level. One that comes up for me, and this goes to like the assumptions people make. There was a hard conversation that myself and a client had because the client wasn't happy with my running of a meeting. And he was sort of new to the experience. He was new to the dynamics. And so what happened is he came to this meeting thinking this agenda was going to occur. I also came to that meeting thinking this agenda was going to occur. So we were aligned, we were ready to go. Well, the players involved, they were not aligned with how this was going to go. And there is a very deep history behind that. And so as the meeting was going and as resistance was being thrown at me, and not just resistance in words, there were tears, there was great pushback. I backed out of the agenda. And I didn't love that I backed out of the agenda, or I had to, but I didn't feel that I had the power to say, okay, sorry you're feeling this way, but we're pushing forward, because that wasn't my position to do. It wasn't my decision. So I sort of backtracked. Well, this client came to me and said, hey, I just wasn't really happy with how that went. And I said, I agree with you. Like, I wasn't happy how that went either. And I would put this under a hard talk, probably on his end to bring it to me, and on my end to deal with the scrutiny and the criticism. But what I thought was beautiful about it was I was like, yeah, I felt the same way. I didn't love it either. But let me tell you why I pivoted away. And once he realized, he was like, oh, I didn't know all of this. And so we do fill in with assumptions, because for the last week, he's probably been thinking, God, why did Mindy do that? Like, I can't believe she did that. And, thinking all these assumptions. But once I told him why, he was like, oh, I get it now. And what was cool was I owned up to it. I was like, yeah, like you should have felt this way. I felt the same way, but I made a strategic decision that I could not continue on this agenda as is, given the dynamics. He didn't know those dynamics. And so a lot of times we are just simply making an error in assumption or a mistake, and we just don't know things. Mm-hmm. So also the lesson in this, I think, is in the hard conversation piece is if you go into a meeting or a situation or a conversation and you're like, I don't like this, or what's going on here? Ask questions. There's a mantra I sort of carry: ask, don't assume. So if I go into a meeting and I'm like, that didn't go well, or I don't like what that person said, don't fill in the blanks. Go to them and say, why did this happen? And most of the time your mind will be changed. And that conversation that I just had was one of those where I was like, hey, let me give you some backstory and why I made the decision. And it wasn't being defensive. It was like, yeah, that wasn't great. And let's talk about it.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
what about you?
Yeah.
Have you ever had something kind of like this happen?
Oh, yes. I've had many hard conversations, but the one that I was thinking of is very similar to a point that you just made where I was working with a client at an organization, and I could just tell from our past like 3 or 4 conversations that the person was basically annoyed with me for some reason, but I had no idea what it was. And so we were finishing up a one-on-one, and I said, hey, like, I've noticed that you seem annoyed, or I'm perceiving that you seem annoyed. Like, is there anything to that? If so, I'd love to know about it. And the person, said, oh, well, just given, workload and things, there were some things that I could do to make, to alleviate some stress and make that person's life easier. And so, there were a couple of things where I said, okay, well, I don't think I can do this because it doesn't make sense from my end, but then also like I can do these few things. And it got it out in the open so that if there was something specific, it can be raised in the future. But then also it's just like these little tweaks that can improve our working relationship. And so that person understood that I like honored and understood the perspective and would be happy to do what I can, to alleviate stress, make productivity higher, and make our connection better. And, that's a very, very small example, but I think normalizing these conversations so that there's not these huge, what's going to happen at my performance review, or, I've got to have this big conversation. Sometimes we do have to have those big overarching conversations, but I think in many ways, like we have largely lost the ability to just say like, hey, next time, like, are you okay? Like, can you send me a calendar invite 48 hours in advance or whatever? Doesn't need to be a huge thing. But can absolutely bubble up if we don't address them, more regularly so that we can build that trust in that relationship.
Yeah. And the thing I think, as you're talking and I'm thinking about my situation that just happened, I think to me, there's greater trust now. Both I'm more trusting of the client because they didn't just ignore this and be upset with me and not tell me. So it allows me to be like, oh, next time before walking into a meeting like this, I should give everyone a heads up of the dynamic that happened 18 months ago. And so it's like you can pick these little lessons learned. And I think that feedback is a gift. And I think hard conversations are a gift. So even if you're on the receiving end of the criticism, it's a gift. But also one of the motivations for you, if you need to have a hard conversation, is recognize you're giving that person a gift of honesty, of integrity, of relationship building. And I think we could avoid a lot of our own heartache if we just leaned into having hard conversations more often.
Oh my gosh, it is the worst feeling in the world to like know or perceive that either someone's upset with you or there's something that happened and they're not bringing it up to, like, I mean, it feels horrible. It's very anxiety inducing.
Yeah.
I remember having a conversation about a personal family relationship issue with a friend of mine, and it was for a very close family member. And I remember the friend saying like, well, you've got to talk, and it had been months. And she was like, well, you've got to talk about it. Like, this is your close family member. Like, it's worth it to you to have this conversation. And I really think that is a question we all have to ask ourselves, right? And we all do ask ourselves, is it worth it to have this conversation? And if you're planning on having a relationship with a family member, or friend, or spouse, or coworker for years to come, 9 times out of 10, it's worth it. And like you said, Mindy, 99 times out of 100, the outcome is going to be positive, especially if we approach it in the right posture of asking questions and doing some active listening. So next time we're going to talk about some tools for having these hard conversations. We would love for anyone, to send us a message, drop in the chat, any questions that you have or things you want to cover. But anything else, Mindy, for today?
No, that's it. Yeah, send us your questions. We can address them in the next one. But yeah, I always think it's good to have some tools in your toolkit and we'll bring those to you next time. And, my challenge to you all is think of that conversation that you've been holding off having and give yourself a timeline. Say, I'm going to have this conversation within the next week, and go out and do it. I promise you it will build the skill and you'll feel a lot better about things. So thanks, everyone.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Have a good week. We'll see you next week.
Bye.
Bye.